Well, a number of you will remember that a few weeks ago I preached a sermon here in the Abbey in which I expressed my dislike of the hymns "All Things Bright and Beautiful." I reminded you that we sometimes have this when baptism parties come, and that Peter and the organist and I, we managed to cut it down to 3 verses and the chorus. Why do I dislike it? Because I think it leads people, especially young people, into doubt rather than belief, into agnosticism rather than certainty. And I want to illustrate this by adding 2 verses that you probably won't know. Here's the first one. The green fly on the roses, the black fly on the beans, the little hairy caterpillars gobbling up the greens. Or what about this rather more sinister verse? The earthquake and tsunami, the devastating flood, these surely make us wonder if God is really good. To these verses I can add an incident that I mentioned at the time in the Abbey that I've never forgotten from my national service days in the Royal Air Force. We had a compulsory chaplain's hour, and the chaplain was trying to prove the existence of God to the assembled airmen by using an approach similar to that in the hymn, "All Things Bright and Beautiful." He was describing the order and beauty of nature and how this pointed to the existence of God, until one of those present interrupted him with the question, "What about lice, Padre?" In vain did the chaplain try to explain the importance of lice in God's purposes and in the great chain of life, and indeed how that great chain of life would be fatally compromised if there were no lice in the world. At the end of that hour, the chaplain had done more to sow doubt in the minds of his listeners than any sort of faith or conviction. He had made the very simple mistake of supposing that God might be an object within our world of time and space whose existence can be proved by logical or rational argument. It is a mistake that people make all the time, and it is at the heart of the present-day attack on Christian belief by the atheist constituency. Worse still, it was the centerpiece of an Anglican program for Sunday school teaching in the 1960s entitled "Alive in God's World," in which the children taking part were shown the wonders of nature in the churchyard and surrounding gardens. I wonder if they saw many slugs or birds being caught by cats. And I wonder how these things were explained to be parts of God's purposes. The trouble with this approach is that the world of nature is highly ambiguous. And if it points to any kind of God, it does not point unambiguously to a loving God, or indeed the God of the Bible. I wonder how many Sunday school children were introduced to agnosticism by this church scheme in the 1960s. Now, this approach overlooks the important distinction between reason and understanding, which is the subject of this evening's lecture. But before I pass on to that, I must make an important observation about the biblical belief in the world as created by God. The Old Testament writers did not live, as did Mrs. Alexander, the writer of the hymn "All Things Bright and Beautiful," in rural Ireland with its temperate climate. They lived in the harsh world of the so-called Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, where rainfall was uncertain and crops vital for the sustenance of life could be devastated by blight, mildew, and locusts, to name only some of the perils listed in Amos chapter 4. The Hebrew word for famine, ra'av, occurs over 100 times in the Old Testament, and a number of stories in the Old Testament have famine as their background. Abraham and his family go down to Egypt from Canaan because of famine in Genesis chapter 12. The story of Joseph, which explains why the Hebrews were in Egypt before the Exodus, has as its background the 7 fat years, followed by the 7 lean years of famine. While the book of Ruth begins with the words, "In the days when the judges judged, there was a famine in the land." It is this famine that causes the family of Naomi to go from Bethlehem to Moab, the event that triggers off the plot of the book of Ruth. When the Israelites and their neighbors in Canaan and Babylon and Assyria looked at the world around them, it did not speak to them of a loving Creator God. For the non-Israelite nations, the supernatural powers that they believed had created the world were in conflict with each other, with the human race suffering the collateral damage of their disputes. Israel's belief in a single Creator God, as expressed so magnificently, for example, in Isaiah chapter 40, did not come from observation of all things bright and beautiful, but from the involvement of God in the life of the nation for judgment and salvation, from spiritual insight, not from logical reasoning. Now, the distinction between understanding and reason was at the center of the thought of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It was set out in his book, Aids to Reflection, published in 1825. By understanding, Coleridge meant that facility of the mind that dealt with observable, empirical things. By reason, he meant that facility of the mind that dealt with non-material things, including spiritual and aesthetic experiences. Making this distinction had enabled Coleridge to break free from the mechanical and materialist thinking with which he had grown up and which dominated much philosophical thought in Britain in the 18th century. For this kind of thought, God was very much a part of the visible universe and governed by its laws. Coleridge made this distinction for several reasons. First, it was impossible for understanding, that is, concerned with the empirical facts of life, possible for understanding to explain why writers such as Shakespeare and Milton were acknowledged to be so great. Second, understanding could not explain why poets such as Wordsworth could write poetry about nature and the human soul, which could resonate so deeply with those who read or heard it. Thirdly, Coleridge had studied German idealist philosophy, especially the critical philosophy of Immanuel Kant. In his first 2 critiques, Kant had made a distinction between pure reason and practical reason. The first, pure reason, dealt with our empirical knowledge. The second, practical reason, with our moral knowledge. And Kant had argued that to say that the world was created could only be done on the basis of our moral knowledge, not our empirical knowledge. Let me try to illustrate the difference as follows. Imagine that you were born into and grow up in a stately home. It had many rooms and many things to be explored, such as libraries. However, you were never allowed to go out of the house. Indeed, there were people in the house who told you that there was no outside, and that the whole of reality was what you saw inside of the house. However, you sometimes looked through a window and thought that you saw things outside, such as trees and birds. When you told this to the others in the house, they told you you were mistaken. There was no outside, and what you thought you saw was a reflection of what was inside, or the product of your own imagination. This is what happens if you think that the whole of reality can be described in terms of understanding, that is, in terms of the objects in the visible world. At this point, my illustration breaks down, because even if the person in the illustration could, in theory, go outside the house and see it from a larger perspective, we cannot go outside our world. Yet just as the person in the illustration looked through the windows and saw what were thought to be trees and birds, the facility of our minds, called reason, senses that there are things beyond our world of time and space. Our apprehensions of goodness and beauty, our longings inspired by music, or our encounter with the sublime in nature speak to us of a world beyond the visible and observable world. And it is this part of our experience that is met and satisfied by religion. Coleridge was very clear that great mischief could be done if the attempt was made to explain by the understanding things that properly belonged to the sphere of reason. Let us go back for a moment to lice. No doubt it might be possible scientifically to explain the place of lice in the chain of being in the universe. However, to think that that would then prove the existence of God is to confuse understanding and reason in Coleridge's sense. It would be to use an empirical explanation to describe a spiritual conviction. The same is true of the all things bright and beautiful approach. What it attempts is a logical demonstration of God's existence, when the real purpose of beauty in nature is to touch and move us personally. I want to mention here two essays by Arthur Clutton Brock in a collection of essays published a long time ago under the heading of The Spirit. And in these essays by Clutton Brock, there is a criticism of the view that science alone can explain the whole of reality as we experience it. He points out the importance of music, and that in music, art escapes from all facts that can be seen or stated in words or paint, while at the same time music can touch and move us personally. He goes on to say that when we perceive beauty in nature and art, what we perceive are not objects, but what he calls universal relations. The most important thing about beauty is that it is not useful. To see objects as beautiful is to see them in a new way, not as objects, but as indicators of something else that can be of no direct use to us, but which can make us aware of a realm of values which we do not wish to master, but which we desire in some way to embrace. This in turn changes our relation to nature. What we call technical reason, which of course is different from Coleridge's, sees nature as an object to be used for the benefit of the human race, and this is not wrong in principle. But reason, as defined by Coleridge, would see nature as a realm of spiritual experience in which we encounter awe, wonder, and beauty. This approach is fully in accord with the Bible. In Psalm 8, we read the following words: "For I will consider thy heavens, even the works of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained. What is man, that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man, that thou visitest him?" The psalmist sees the heavens and the moon and the stars not merely as objects. They arouse in him an experience of awe and wonder. These experiences are not useful to him in any practical way. They point beyond the objects themselves to a dimension that is beyond his comprehension. I want at this point to quote an important passage from William Temple's book, Christus Veritas. Speaking of the articles of the Christian Creed, he writes that, quote, "All the articles of the Creed name objects of practical trust. When a man says, 'I believe in God,' he ought not to mean that after a careful review of the evidence, he inclines to the opinion that there probably exists a being who may not improperly be called God. He ought to mean, 'I put my trust in God. I am determined to live in reliance on his love and power.' To conclude that there probably exists a being who may not improperly be called God is to make a judgment from the realm of understanding, as defined by Coleridge. To say, 'I put my trust in God. I am determined to live in reliance on his love and power,' is to make a commitment based on the use of reason, as defined by Coleridge. If this is correct, if the path to the kind of believing commitment described by William Temple is via reason and not understanding, how does this believing commitment come about? The answer is that it comes as a response to proclamation or preaching. Paul is our best guide here. In the first letter to the Corinthians we read, I quote, "For after that in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God, it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. But unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God." 1 Corinthians 1, 21-23. Proclamation or preaching can take various forms. It can be done via a liturgical service. And it is Paul who reminds us that when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, I quote, "As often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, ye do show the Lord's death till he come," where the Greek verb translated show in the authorized version is katangeline, meaning to proclaim, which is how the Revised Standard Version renders it. As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he come. Proclamation can also come via hymns. And in the English-speaking tradition, one thinks especially of the hymns of Isaac Watts and Charles Wesley. Proclamation can be done by way of dramatic enactment of the events of Holy Week and Good Friday, as well as by preaching in the context of a service. What happens in preaching and proclamation, whatever form it takes, is that we give expression to initiative towards us that has come from God. As Paul puts it, we preach not ourselves, but Christ Jesus the Lord, and ourselves your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, hath shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. 2 Corinthians 4 verses 5 to 6. The fact that the initiative in proclamation comes from God accounts for the apparent absurdity of the message. If it had been left to human understanding to devise a religion, would it have devised something that required us to look at a crucified criminal and say, "This is the Son of God, the Saviour of the world"? It is perhaps at this point that we can see most clearly the distinction between the role of understanding and the role of reason as defined by Coleridge in regard to the Christian faith. The attempt to prove the existence of God by looking at all things bright and beautiful is totally different from pointing to a man on the cross and inviting people to put their trust in the God who is there revealed. In his Aids to Reflection, Coleridge called attention to the mischief that can be caused when understanding and reason are not properly distinguished, and when understanding is applied to things that are beyond the sphere of empirical experience. In the final part of this lecture, I want to explore this in relation to Christian belief today, using as my example the so-called Apostles' Creed. Now, I would not want to claim that this creed is an adequate statement of Christian belief. It says nothing about the Bible, the church, the sacraments, or the atonement. Yet I'm happy to recite it in church services, thereby identifying myself with the Christian tradition that wrote it and has preserved it. If the proper distinction between reason and understanding is not made, two errors can arise. On the one hand, it can be maintained that in order to be a Christian, a person must believe wholeheartedly in every clause of the creed. On the other hand, because some of these clauses are problematic, the conclusion may be drawn that the creed is useless and that its presence in public worship is an embarrassment. Around the beginning of the year 1906, a fellow of an Oxford college wrote to the Bishop of Oxford asking to be considered for ordination. As a fellow of an Oxford college, he had the right to be considered for ordination, and he sent the bishop a statement of his beliefs, including his view that he could only accept the doctrine of the virgin birth very tentatively. The previous year he had written to a friend that he was, quote, pretty clear, unquote, that the virgin birth ought not to be in the creed. Because of this, the Bishop of Oxford decided that he could not accept the young man for ordination. Fortunately for the subsequent history of the Church of England, this young man had a distinct advantage. His father had been the previous Archbishop of Canterbury. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And on the strength of this, he got himself invited to Lambeth Palace to discuss his situation with the then Archbishop of Canterbury. The upshot of all this was that he was ordained by the Archbishop of Canterbury in the December of 1908. If he had not had this advantage of being an archbishop's son, the Church of England might have been deprived of its greatest archbishop for 1,000 years, namely Archbishop William Temple. Temple's difficulty was not unique then nor since. In 1962, I spent the summer term at St. George's College, Jerusalem, together with about 20 other ordinands from various colleges. We were invited to tea by the wife of the dean of the cathedral. She was very firm in her opinions, and she left us in no doubt that unless we could believe all the articles of the Creed, and especially the virgin birth, we ought not to be offering ourselves for ordination. If you look at the Apostles' Creed, it will be clear that some of its clauses have to do with understanding, and that some have to do with reason. For example, that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried, are statements of facts of history that can be verified by documents, Tacitus, Josephus, other than those in the New Testament. However, where does the virgin birth fit in? Is it a matter of understanding or a matter of reason? The historical evidence for the virgin birth is uncertain. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke state that Jesus was indeed born of a virgin. However, the virgin birth is not mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament. It forms no part of the apostolic preaching, and there are hints in the Gospels that suggest that Jesus had two natural parents. Here I must introduce you to some of the mysteries of New Testament textual criticism. At Mark 6:3, one of the earliest papyrus witnesses to the text reads, "Is not this the carpenter's son?" A reading that was soon corrected to, "Is not this the carpenter?" in order to remove the suggestion that Jesus really was Joseph's son. Incidentally, I had a look at a lot of modern translations of the New Testament, and in not one of them do I find what I'm sure is the correct reading followed, i.e. that what was at Mark 6:3 was, "Is not this the carpenter's son?" Oliver Quick, in his book Doctrines of the Creed, is quite clear that the historical evidence is inconclusive. He goes on to say that it is theology that must determine our belief whether or not the virgin birth is a historical fact. This is a classic example of the confusion between reason and understanding from a theologian whom I greatly admire and respect. Theology can never decide matters of history. Only historical evidence can do that. However, Quick is fair-minded enough to allow that there will be people who, quote, "may prefer to think that inasmuch as the manhood of Jesus was no superhumanity, but our own human nature, spiritually fashioned anew by an amazing act of divine condescendence, the physical condition of its conception and birth did not vary from those which nature ordinarily requires." I hope you followed all that. What he's saying basically is that if we want to believe that Jesus was truly human with us, then we may think that God was just as capable of creating that ordinary humanity marvelously than if there was a virgin birth. This was not Quick's own view, but he was sufficiently sensitive to the issues involved to see that any dogmatic insistence that an ordinand must believe in the virgin birth in order to be ordained was unacceptable. And we must add that such insistence would not only confuse reason and understanding, but would fail to see the distinction between believing in a person and believing that something may or may not have happened. There are, however, clauses in the Apostles' Creed that clearly belong to the sphere of reason in Coleridge's sense, not understanding. Principal among them would be the first clause, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. And the second clause, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. As I hope this lecture will have made clear, belief in God as Creator is not a deduction from the visible universe, but a response of faith to the proclamation of the gospel. The same is true of the second clause about Jesus Christ. But in the history of theology, many attempts have been made by using understanding to demonstrate the sonship of Jesus. One method has been to take one of the great I am sayings from St. John's Gospel and to say on the basis of it that Jesus was either insane or a liar or telling the truth, with the emphasis on this third possibility. Or attention has been drawn to the account of the miracles of Jesus in the Gospels as proof of his divinity, ignoring the fact that Jesus himself said that it was an evil generation that looked for such signs. A third approach has been that of the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies in the life and ministry of Jesus. What all these approaches overlook is that the divinity of Jesus consists of the fact that he is able to help us to come to trusting and living faith in God wherever his works and words are proclaimed, and that this coming to faith belongs to the sphere of reason, not understanding. An opposite application of understanding to the second clause of the Creed can question whether it is in fact true. We are back where we were last week, with the point that it's possible to interpret the Gospels in ways that produce a Jesus quite different from the Jesus of the Church's belief. Also, throughout the history of the Church, there have been attacks on the divinity of Jesus on various grounds. For example, that God is essentially spirit and cannot be manifested in human flesh. A popular form of the objection is that Jesus might have been a great moral or religious teacher, but he cannot have been the Son of God. The implication here is that we already know what God is like, and on the basis of this, we conclude that Jesus cannot have been divine while at the same time being fully human. The Christian affirmation is that God was in Christ, 2 Corinthians 5:19, and that by responding to the message of what God has done in Jesus Christ, we are drawn to faith in God. English philosophy, as opposed to German philosophy, this of course is a dangerous generalization, has always tended to be one-dimensional, to prefer either or to both and. German philosophy is much more ready to be dialectical, to accept that reality from a human perspective is sufficiently messy and ambiguous to deny to human understanding the possibility that reality can be described in straightforward terms. Dialectical thinking accepts that it may be necessary to try to explain reality in terms of contradictions by holding together contradictory statements. Luther's theology was dialectical, as in declarations such as that we are simultaneously sinners and justified by God's grace. We owe to Coleridge the fact that he was able to break free of the one-dimensional thinking in mechanistic and deterministic terms with which he had grown up, and to formulate the distinction between reason and understanding with which this lecture has been concerned. I hope that I've done a little to demonstrate its importance for Christian belief and proclamation today, as part of what we owe to the broad church of the 19th century.